All right. Well, again, good morning. This is one that's I'm really excited about delivering. It's a little bit different of a message than we've had in the past. I know this is a part of a longer series that many of you may have been involved in. This is an aspect of the area as far as employees go and employee retention and such and so forth that I've been extremely involved in. For you that I have not met yet, I am new to California community action, going on about a year and a half, but I'm not new to community action as a whole. I've been doing community action for about 14 years, all across this country, in different places, which included one stint as an executive director, one as a chief operating officer. And that's why Slated, was asked to kind of do this presentation about increasing employee compensation. There was a session yesterday across the nation, a national partnership collective around how to reach out and look at different funding source for employee compensation. This is not that conversation. This is a totally different conversation. And this is about increasing employee compensation internally. And so we wanted to bring this concept to the table because this is something I've been pretty heavily involved in multiple different agencies. One, like I said, where I was the ED, and one as the chief operating officer. And so we want to kind of talk about how that process went and how we were able to go about that. So to get us really started is ultimately the goal of this is about putting more food on the plate. And let me get this started. Okay. And I want to set the framework before we begin and really get into the meat that's on the plate. I know that's what a lot of you are here for, but it's extremely important that we set the table in the correct way to make sure that the information is received the best it can be. And this conversation today is going to be about increasing the employee wages. And the way to do that is really creating a culture of innovation and thinking about how we run, how we oversee, and how we lead some of our community action agencies through a process that will allow us to access additional opportunities for employee compensation. And in order to have that culture of innovation, it takes a lot of different subcultures to do that. So that's what we're really going to be talking about today. And I'll kind of go through in what does it mean to create that culture of innovation and allow that to happen. And then on how these other subcultures work to achieve that. And so these are some of the different subcultures we'll be talking about, and then how they create the opportunity, they create the practice, they create the systems that allow us to be able to do the end goal, which is, again, increase that employee compensation. Not to mention there's a lot of other outcomes with it as well. But one of the things that was always a value to me, and while I was always attracted to the Community Action Network, is we're really in the opportunity to evolve and innovate. Just by our base funding in the CSBG grant, the Community Service Block Grant, it allows us a lot of flexibility in the way that we operate our agencies. Patricia, can operate hers one way, and someone on the clear other side of the state can operate theirs completely different. And that's a beautiful opportunity for us to be able to really think about it. And in today's context, and the way that we're bringing this to the table as an opportunity, is just a different way. It's a one way for people to continue to look at. And one of the important parts when I did this practice was to understand how we really define success as our agencies, and how the agencies I ran define success. And I always found this a really interesting tweet that came out. It said, "Who succeeds at Amazon? Explorers and pioneers. Who fails? Those who focus on killing our competitors." And one of the things that Jeff Bezos, whether you like him or not, or think he should pay more taxes or doesn't pay enough taxes, or whatever you may think about him, one of the things that's always been said is that his platform really created an opportunity for other entrepreneurs to either become very successful at selling a product or not. And that's a fact. And so that's a good opportunity for folks. And one of the things that when he was asked about, who's successful on his platform and who's not, and it's really about the ones that focus on running their business better. And one of the big major issues was about being, explorer in that sense, really looking for different ways to meet needs for their customers. And that's the ones that excel versus the ones that really just focused in on how do I do what I do the best, and how do I just focus in on just that system separately. And I thought that was a really interesting point into thinking about how we separate this up. And so when we start thinking about our ability to progress as agencies, one of the shifts that we want to take that thinking to have that culture shift is really to think about that our future as agencies really will be less about the money we bring in or the power, the size of our agencies, but realistically about our ability to be agile, and our ability to have networking and our ability to share information across the board. And let me talk about what I mean. We really realized that under COVID, right? So when COVID came in, for the longest, we're all too often called upon to be that organization. And for many years, leading into COVID and the CARES Act money and the shift in there, for many years before that, we were constantly measured by success about how many families we brought out of poverty, how much community change did we create. We even started to see the network outcomes in our reporting really start to hone in on those. And many of the activities at a national and statewide level were around what are those innovative practices you're doing to get people out of poverty? What are those things that you're doing to change your communities? And then all of a sudden we have a pandemic and we're asked and looked at to say, oh, by the way, again, we need you guys to be Johnny on the spot and do emergency services. We need you to be there at the front door. So all the while they want us to be able to have these long-standing, outcomes, which we want to do. It's a constant shift back. And so the idea is that for us to be able to always be successful in that sense, we really have to be agile in the systems that we create. And the systems can't be around just simply saying, well, we want to be long-term outcome driven for our families, or we want to be short-term successful at delivering emergency services. It has to have a system in which it allows either one of those to thrive, but at the same time, again, allow us to shift easily from one to the next, but also to shift the way that we ultimately begin to do business. One of the big quotes I want to bring in is from Ben Howitz. So big companies have plenty of great ideas, but they do not innovate because they need a whole hierarchy of people to agree that a new idea is good in order to pursue it. If one smart person figures out something wrong with an idea, often to show off or to consolidate power, that's usually enough to kill it. How many of you have ever seen this in an organization, right? You bring something new to the table that somebody runs in and says, hey, I'm new here, or I've been here a while and I've observed for a little bit. But here may be a better way to do this process. Here's an opportunity, or here's something we should look at and consider. And you'll have 10 people say, that's a great idea, we should look at it. And one person says, well, we tried that before, or, that may work, but if it does work, then we do have to worry about this in the process. And I bring this up because when we talk about creating a whole culture of innovation, it's about creating a lot of these other subcultures. And one of those that becomes really scary in that process is the ability to not acknowledge that it doesn't take a complete consensus. It doesn't take 100% vote to realize that this is something we need to focus our energy on. And so if we change that mindset, we start to look at it, then we have the opportunity to start to find opportunities for success, again, to our main goal here, which is to find things around opportunities to find additional funding. So one of the things I want to bring up that's really interesting when we think about processes as a whole or what we do, we all remember, or many of us may remember the Walkman. We remember that. I'm going way back, like 3 things back. I could probably even say like other items, but the important part is who made the Walkman was Sony. And a lot of us know about Sony. What we don't know is in the previous years, where did Sony make the majority of their profits? It really wasn't around electronics or even filming music. It was life insurance. And that is such a wild idea for people to hear. They're like, wait a second, how did this occur? How did Sony make their money off life insurance? And there's a whole process. We could tell the whole story about it. But ultimately, what was interesting about that is that they had a model, they had a system to sell electronics. They were heavily involved in the film and music business and bringing that out. But where they really saw and focused in on was selling life insurance to employees, selling life insurance to a huge organization, selling life insurance to the countries that they were in, because they created a system that they found within their own system that was very profitable. And that's kind of wild to think of, to say, okay, we're in the electronic business and that's the only thing that we're going to do. So I use that example because in community action, sometimes we say, oh, we're in the service driven, we're in the outcome driven business, and we solely focus on grant funding. And how do we get grant funding? And how does grant funding make us more money? We got to get more grants. We got to get more foundation money. We got to get more and more money. Well, what Sony did is started to look at it and say, yeah, but part of our process is a profitable process for us in that life insurance business. And maybe we should continue to focus in on that and seeing how, just that idea may also make us a profit. And so that's why I bring it to this table, because that's what we want to shift to in order to have that, idea around a culture of innovation. So that first piece to me around the culture of innovation is a culture of questioning. And one of the things is just really ultimately creating the idea is, why are we doing it this way? And is there a better approach? right? Why are we doing this way? And is there a better approach? Now, many of you will know this story, the 5 monkeys experiment, but I like to share it in this because this is very important as we set the framework for this discussion. So in the 5 monkeys experiments, a group of scientists placed 5 monkeys in a cage, and in the middle, a ladder with bananas on the top. Well, of course, what's the first thing that happens? The monkeys see the bananas, they want to go after those bananas, right? Because they like bananas. So the monkeys want to go up the ladder to go to get the bananas. Well, every time a monkey went up the ladder, the scientists would soak the rest of the monkeys with cold water. Now, you can't do this experiment anymore, but they would soak these monkeys with cold water, obviously make it miserable. And they kept doing that until after a while, every time a monkey went up the ladder, the others would eventually say, I don't want to be soaked. I'm going to beat you off that ladder, right? So the other monkeys started to regulate it. They didn't even need the water anymore. They just said, we're not going up there. And then after some time, some monkey just dared. They never went, regardless of the temptation. The banana was sitting there. Everybody stood around. So the part of the experiment where it gets really interesting is after several of these times, and after once all the monkeys decided they weren't going to go, they took one of the monkeys out and replaced it with a brand new monkey, right? And the new monkey comes in there, having never seen this. And of course, what do they try to do? Hey, there's bananas up there. Let's go get it. So what do the other 4 do? They draw them down, right? And so what happens is over time, they continue to replace all the monkeys until all the monkeys have been replaced. None of the monkeys have ever been soaked with water. But what happens? They still have that same process. They still draw down every single monkey because they said, hey, in their mind, the way this happens is, I don't know why we're doing this. I just know that this is what I was taught when we got here. You don't go after those bananas, right? I don't know. But one of the things we have happened notoriously in community action in all kind of business is someone comes in, or it doesn't even have to be new. Someone experienced says, I have a new idea. And someone shoots that down and says, we don't do that. We don't do that. That's not the process we do. We have to do it this way. Why do we do it this way? I don't know. That's just how things are done around here. And so we think about that. And this sounds very familiar, right? And this is an old story. This is an old experiment that's been shared, but it's very, very important to set the stage for our discussion today, because what's going to happen is you are going to start thinking about that culture of questioning, and you're going to bring that back and say, okay, let's create this culture of questioning. And by the way, I want to make sure that we set this culture of questioning up and start looking at all our opportunities for profit, our opportunities to find additional funding. And we don't want to shut that down. We want to create that culture of questioning that really allows for people to bring all sorts of creative ideas. And the reason I bring it up with you guys today, because it starts with leaders. It starts with leaders who constantly question. And then it takes us to the next part where we actually reward and we encourage, we create a space for this to start finding where this funding is at and what's happening. And most importantly is to make sure that if you see a change from individuals and people are coming down on that change because it feels like they're challenging authority or they're challenging a system, which again can be misunderstood a lot of times as challenging authority, and it's not really. It's just saying, hey, there may be a better way to the system that's not been thought about before. We've got to make sure and shut down any opportunity that tries to smash that. We want to make sure that that's there, because this is where this really starts to happen, where things start to occur. Now, one of the things that we'll have to overcome is most organizations, again, are into a culture of conformity. So we conform to the way the system and the process works. That could be for a lot of different reasons, and we want to acknowledge that a lot of times conformity is a nice, comfortable place to be, right? I understand the policies. I know how this process works. I know how we do this. I'm comfortable with that, so I'm going to conform to that. And it really does come from that military model. So the second part is, once we begin to create that culture of questioning, or let's say a culture of inquiry, you really just start to say that the questions you raise were carefully considered and may trigger ongoing discussion. That's the purpose, right? Either really just want to trigger that discussion, and we want to get away. So I wanted to set that stage around there and making sure that we understand that this is going to be a large part of that. And so even when we get to the point where we have some questions, or we have some feedback, or you guys have some questions for me, I'll be coming from that standpoint. So ultimately what we want to do is break the pattern and start asking the questions. What is the question we're going to ask today? Is that we can have the best talent, we can have the best ideas, and we can have the best programs. But if our systems, the way we operate, do not align, being successful with funding starts looking as it's a matter of underfunding. So I want to share my experience and how we change that and a lot of that process, and hoping that it helps other agencies, expedite that process and be interested in the overall process. So in my agency, this is what the org chart looked like. You know, and we thought we were good. We were a big program, $25 million, we thought was extremely large, you know, and I thought was large until I got to California and realized what some of the numbers are out here, but extremely large program. And we had these very distinct divisions, and you know, folks did this and they did that and what it was, and really thought we were organized. And when we got in there, we were very organized. People had a role, people had a duty. But we started thinking about the process, and we started that culture of questioning to say, explain to me kind of, you know, how the process is if people come into our agency from a client perspective, right? So that was the first question we had. If I was a client, what would it look like? Well, after we mapped it, this is kind of what it looks like. So if people came either into our agency or needed a referral to another place or all our community partners, how did that work? This is how it would go. And that was always the question. Well, it depends. Did you come in as a child? Are you coming in as a 5-year-old? Are you coming in as a grandparent? Are you coming in for a specific service? Are you coming in for Head Start? Or were you a referral from somebody else? And we started to acknowledge that all these processes were there, right? This may look familiar to some of you of how it feels and what it looks like. One of the things that was really important for me, though, was to create that culture of connecting those dots. And I want to go back to that. One of the things that we were able to really do is to establish and get people to agree that every time someone took one of these lines from one place to another, that it cost us money. And I'll explain that a little bit better. So if somebody came in for an emergency service, when they walk in the door, they have to meet with a receptionist, and that receptionist says, "Hey, how are you doing? What are you here for today?" "Well, I have an appointment." Okay, that person has to talk to that person, and then they have to transfer them to that department, and they go to that department. That's an activity. That's an activity. And one of the things we explained is every time that activity happens, there is a cost associated with it. Everything that happens within our agency, there is a cost associated with that. And so we should question every single activity if there's a different way to do that, if there's a different way to understand it, and really start to connect those dots as to why do we do that, right? Because to me, really, I knew that ultimately nothing really is original, right? We had all these knowledge and had all these people with knowledge of their own programs, but what we weren't doing is really using our experience of those programs to connect those dots and to start understanding how we could change that. Now, this is an old diagram, but it really kind of sets the stage if you're able to see it. So one of the things that we did is we threw away all the services that we completed. We chunked all that. We chunked the whole idea of what a service was. And we said at the end of the day, the ultimate part is that every program had an intake process, right? Every single program had an intake process. And so we tried to transform to what it would look like in the two major areas that we could define. Now, one of the things I want to say is, again, going to the creating the culture of that questioning that allows it to happen. By all means, did I have people present when we were doing this development that said, well, our families are different, right? Our systems are different, or our processes are required to be different. And so we had to handle a lot of those questions and begin to analyze and say, we understand your questioning, but remember, we're trying to create an opportunity that allows for us to really think about that. And is it really different? And a lot of times that was one-on-one conversations after the communication to make people feel more comfortable to understand is, I know this is scary to think about doing something completely different because you've been doing it this way for 10 years and you've been able to monitor that process for 10 years. And so you know that process really well, but are your families really different, and bringing that down? And this was so important because ultimately our goal was to create as few lines from one dot to the next as possible. So we really wanted to get A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever those dots were, down to a singular line as much as we can. And then the next process was to say, let's analyze each piece of the way that we do that, and to really think about the cost of that and what that process is. And are there ways that we can lower that cost to us, in an employment side, in order to find additional funding? So let me say that again. My goal eventually was to say, let's lower the amount of tasks and the hours that we're having to spend doing those tasks so that I can pay more per hour for fewer tasks. Make sense? Okay. So let me tell you, one of the biggest things that came out of that was what we said earlier, which was being able to be client-based and network sharing. And one of the biggest things that we found is that we use a lot of time on intake processes repeatedly over and over again. And those were intake processes that had multiple keystrokes. And we started thinking about all the way down to the fact that keystrokes cost money. And the longer it takes somebody to type something in. Now, I'm not saying we only help people with short names so that we can lower keystrokes, but what we try to do is analyze and really look at that process to say, how many times is somebody entering a name? How many times is somebody entering an address? How many times? And then how many people we're paying to do that? And why are we paying people to do that? And here comes the second part of it is, and this is a lot of things that people don't like, and they set the room on fire when I talk about it, is we started advancing into technology to saying, how many more times can we get the client themselves to do keystrokes? And everybody doesn't love that. Now, and that's not the answer for everyone. Here in California, we found that out with the emergency rental program. You can't just put a system out there and say, fill this out and you'll get services. It doesn't work necessarily that. But there are small parts to the process, and it's not one size fits all. Our goal wasn't to ultimately get all 100% of people to fill out their own information, right? But we knew if we could get 20 to 30% of our families to fill out that information, now we're starting to chip away at that. So one of the keys I tell people all the time is, I understand when everybody goes to the grocery store, some people don't like self-checkout. And that's okay. You don't have to use self-checkout. But you can establish that Walmart, a major company that invested a lot of money into this idea, that they know they can put one employee in there, right? And that one employee can oversee 10 self-checkouts, and they're only paying one person. I would like to believe, because they do that, they will have additional money to pay one person versus paying 10 checkout people, right? If you're spreading that out. Now, whether Walmart does that or not, and they put it in their profits, that's up to them, and we won't talk about that. But for us, is to say, okay, I know I have a balance of funding that I could do for employment. If I have one person that can oversee an intake room where that multiple people can sit down and go through those things, then that changes things, right? Money starts to open up. And so that was a process for us that we were able to do that. So that's just a piece of it. The second part came into, how do we do that? I want to say this, one of the systems that I use was called COPAS, Child Complaining and Administration. One of the biggest things about it, and one of the hardest things to get people to agree to understand, is that it had an external portal. It had a parent portal, it had a family portal. So when a family came in and scheduled services, they would schedule, they could go online, they could schedule it, or they could make a phone call and we'd schedule it for them. We could send a link to their cell phone. We'd send a link to their email. We could send a link to whatever they may be. They click on that link and they could put as much information or as little information as they could in there. At the end of the day, if they got their name in there and their kids' names in there, that's a win. That's a few less keystrokes. Now, of course, here's the backup. What do we have happen? People say, well, the problem is when you let families put in their own information, they misspell things. I get it. It's not 100% accurate, right? But if I can look at you and say, your name is David, is D-A-V-I-D in here? Yes, and you move on. That's quicker. Those times are quicker. So the time trials start to be quicker in that sense. And again, what we found is after we started running it, 40 to 50% of the time people got it right. And it wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfect, but it did start to speed up the process, right? It started to help part of that. And it just took away those very, very single things. The other part that we learned is creating that centralized intake system and allowing it to share across the board made all the impact in the world. It made all the impact in the world. Because again, I'm only asking a family to put their name in once, but we had to make sure we created the process to understand, how that worked. So what happened with that? Well, we went from having 5 different divisions with 15 different workers, taking the same intake, having the same process, not to mention speeding up the front receptionist desk, because she didn't have to decide, and it was a lady, she didn't have to decide what department are you supposed to go to, which took so much time, right? Versus when they walked in the door, she immediately knew where they were going. And that was it. That was a quick process, and so you think, well, that doesn't matter. It does matter for a couple of different reasons. First of all, the happiness level of our employee really raised, right? Because the process is easier and they can get into doing some of the other things that they like to do. I never really found, and even as a frontline social worker at one time, I was never excited about data entry. We're still not. Lawrence and I laugh about it all the time. I still hate doing my timesheet. It's data entry is a pain. That's not the part you didn't go to, to be a social worker, to do data entry, you went because you wanted to help people. So we're looking at those systems. Not only does it raise the quality of the workplace for our employees and keep them longer. Now I'm starting to see where I don't have to have as many because they're not doing those same processes. So it's really analyzing that, and it really changed what we're able to employ, and pay people. And let me say something about it. All those processes that we talked about take a lot of dedication because any kind of change management happens. But what we started to really find is that ultimately it allowed us the opportunity to really think about it and invest in folks, but really it allowed us to get people involved in that investment. And that had to be very, very clear that it was all in together. One of the things I want to go back that I kind of missed, I wanted to show really quick, is when we looked at this organizational chart, what we found is most of our vacancies and most of our difficulty is what we consider difficulty at the salary level. The salary levels that we didn't feel like we were hitting. We're on these ones hanging at the bottom here, right? These ones that have multiple positions, right? We're talking about teachers, teacher assistants, cooks, cook aides, social workers, all the frontline staff, right? That's the ones we have mass amount of positions. That's the ones we wanted to raise. So we focused in on that, and we started to realize that let's look at those processes. Let's really hone in on what we're doing in that system. And I think that was important because it really, it really created us the ability to kind of question how that was taking so much and how we're able to really focus in. Now I want to jump to the next part. Another sub part of that culture of innovation is that really overall culture of curiosity and being curious. And so as children, curiosity was our primary learning tool. When we accidentally discovered orange by mixing red and yellow, curiosity sent us on exciting finger painting frenzies to try all possible color combinations. But where is it in the workplace? Well, here's the fact. According to Gallup's 2019 State of American Workplace Report, 30% of employees are actively committed to doing a good job. 50% of employees merely put their time in, and 20% act out their discontent in counterproductive ways, negatively influencing their coworkers. So this is important. So when that negativity starts to sit in, this really started to change our conversation. What we wanted to ask was, we wanted to become very, very curious about was, how much does that 20% and those processes of that 20% affect the other business? Because to me, it became all about productivity and about the ability to increase productivity was really, really important, but it wasn't all we did. So it did start a conversation of just being about curious to say, if our employees are not happy, why are they not happy? And how much of that production does it not cost? How much does that 20% affect that other 50%, right? And we're okay with that 50%. Not everybody says, this is my dream job and I'm showing up every day because I love it. Some people say, I just want the job and I want to go home, and that's okay. And so we just wanted to be very, very curious in that process. But what that led to is to understanding overall, what is our cost for employees across the board? And what are the procedures that they're doing? What are the processes that are happening in their daily activity, especially on that 20%, which are so costly, right? So whether that costly in turnover, losing those employees because they're angry, or those employees being non-productive, what are some of those major costs? Well, through that discussion, and let me talk about that for a little bit. So when we analyzed part of that, we started looking at what is our overall labor cost. And we know that labor cost per hour is gross pay plus all annual cost divided by the actual worked hours per year. So that's what we knew. So we said, okay, we know there's gross pay, and that's what we're trying to increase, right? We wanted to increase the gross pay. So what are the measures that we can find to do that? We started considering, oh, what about all those annual costs? So that was our second part of being curious. We just dove right in and started looking at what are all those annual costs. And I'm going to get to my whole story in a minute. Obviously, there are certain things that we can't change. I mean, we can't change what the FICA taxes are, right? We know that's there. We can't necessarily change how we do that. We can change that. We can look at the process of how we pay those and how that fiscal function works, and if that's taking forever, and does our systems do that to allow that to happen automatically so that there's not a lengthy process? So I'm not paying somebody in fiscal to do that for a long time. Sure, we can do that part of it, but not a ton that we can change. In that payroll taxes, one of the things that do have the opportunity to change and look at is that unemployment taxes. Okay, and so different agencies have different agreements with that and how their unemployment taxes work. But this was really important to us. And so one of the things that we brought up in my agency in Arkansas is to say, this is our unemployment tax rate. This is currently what it is. So as we're losing people and they're filing unemployment, this is what it costs. we brought that to the whole agency. We let them know that our annual payroll is X million dollars. And this percent of that is this is what it costs because we're losing employees. And so that's very, very difficult. And so what we want to try to do is encourage folks to stay on and to be there. And so what we try to do is figure out why people were claiming such unemployment, what was happening, what was the deal. And part of that was changing the way in which we interviewed. And that made a huge difference. We were bringing people on because they fit a position. And part of that was, I had managers at the time that didn't really understand that, well, this person came in, they did a job, it doesn't matter, go ahead and file unemployment and go off. And again, if that's what personally is best for somebody financially, we understood it. But really have an explanation for them to say, this is the issue when you advise somebody that that's okay and you feel that's okay. This is how it's affecting our overall payroll, right? We know that it is causing this. And we made it a community or an agency-wide issue to say, here's our numbers. Here's what this changes. If this changes 1%, if this changes 2%, this is how much additional funding we have that we can commit can go to payroll instead. And if we do that for so many months and can prove that we can keep that down, then we're all involved in that. And so then we became very curious as to what those processes were. We found out a lot about how it was advised. And what we really found out is that many of our employees had no idea that employers paid into unemployment. They assumed it was a government program. That's a big eye-opening experience that, no, this is a cost to doing business, and it costs us to do business when you advise somebody to go off on that. So that was very, very beneficial. And again, didn't solve everything, didn't keep people from quitting and going on unemployment or, reasons to do things. What we really found too is in our HR department is that they just assumed that everybody should go on unemployment and it was okay. Again, that's a harsh decision that not everybody necessarily likes, and sometimes it doesn't work out. But again, if people were doing negative behavior and we had to let them go, we just didn't automatically let them go on unemployment. And people agreed with that and they understood that. But it's also getting leadership and mainly board buy-in to understand, because that was a shift for that agency I was at. They let everybody go on unemployment. And then they were upset why we couldn't pay more. And so you had to have a full conversation with the board to say, this is what's going to happen. People are going to call. They're going to be upset that you just didn't let them go on unemployment. But if you let that person go on unemployment without fighting that, then on the other side of it is the people that are here that are still contributing and trying to do stuff, I can't pay them to keep them from doing the same thing. So it's going to be hard to get to that living wage if they keep doing that. So that was a focus in on really, really honing in on that piece. Employee benefits. Obviously, we all know negotiating health insurance costs. Absolutely. One of the first things I did in Jackson, Mississippi when I was there is institute those health rewards plans. And a lot of you do this already, right? It's ultimately going in there, giving people an incentive to go to the gym, giving people incentives for going to their routine checkups versus waiting to an emergency. But it's really having those costs. One of the big differences too that I realized, and this is what we're talking about being curious. So really what we found is our health insurance wasn't a huge expense, but if you look down at the other expenses, our big expense was our workers' comp insurance. This was the issue. When I got to this agency for agency our size, we were paying about $400,000 a year in workers' comp insurance, which was outrageous and unheard of for an agency our size. So we became curious to figure out what was happening. Was it a facilities issue? Were we really just not training on safety? Was it all those aspects? What we really found out, what it was, is our health insurance had such a high deductible. Right, our health insurance had such a high deductible, and we had horrible practices of certain management denying, reasons for sick time or for times to be off, having to validate that. So it was a process. So what was happening is people were using, workers' compensation as their way to get their health insurance, as a way to get their treatment, and it became so difficult. It's a really difficult thing to prove or not prove, and it became so costly. Even if you get one denied, the process once somebody files is so lengthy, it's so long. So we announced it. We announced it and said, here's our issue. Here's how much we spend on workers' comp. And we put a target to that to say, here's $400,000, and we had 400 employees. So that's $1,000 an employee. Now, we're going to get that to zero? Absolutely not. But we said, here it is. That's costing us over $1,000 employees, because people are wanting to go get this health insurance. What's the issue? People were very clear. Our deductibles are too high. That's one thing. Makes it very difficult. We're not paid enough to have $1,000 deductible. So immediately, what do? We start focusing in on that, because I would rather spend an additional $50,000 or $60,000 in health insurance and save 140, 200,000 in workers' comp insurance, and then be able to take that additional money. But again, we made it a community project. This was a big, huge deal for us as it really started to change things. We retrained management and how to handle work request off and how to manage time off versus how to use disciplinary action where it needs to be and not punishing people with time off. All those things matter. And it started creating different outcomes within our HR platform. While we're in that realm, so then we get into HR and we start to understand something that's really, really extremely important, which is time to hire. We got into the agency, and when I got into this last agency, the time to hire, the process to hire went something like this. Somebody would typically come up. We only took applications on Tuesdays and Thursdays, apparently, because I guess Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you couldn't apply for jobs. They had to fill out a paper application, and everybody there had to fill out an application, right? We took no resumes, we took none of that. You had to fill out an application. You had to come in, the office, and you do that. The applications went into a file. And when that director decided that, when that HR director decided we had enough applications, they put a call into that director. That director would come down and look through and pull all the applications that they were interested in. And then they would tell them the ones they wanted to interview. Then that interview, and it keeps going back and forth. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of back and forth, a lot of back and forth. And a lot of it was because it was very HR director centered. We changed that. And so what happened is obviously going to electronic applications, obviously going to full-time. Anybody can apply when they want to apply. We need more people. But more importantly is it was investing in a data system. And we use Career Builder, and not the Career Builder you think of from the recruiting standpoint. That didn't do a lot for us, but the data system that they were able to use. And what it allowed is a very easy system for people to either A, fill out an application, or B, put in a resume, and it drops it into a box and essentially creates it based on whatever that job is they're able to apply for. And then when they were able to apply for that job, they could apply for multiple jobs if they feel like they qualify for it. And then it put them into a database. And that database sat there and it was full. What we did is also change the process to say, if you are a supervisor and you have this position open, it is your job to go in there and pull out of that database and mark the ones, right? You mark the ones you want to interview and you mark the ones that you don't. And they automatically, that process automatically happens and they're going through. Now, what we did on the backside of that is, because what was one of the things that came up from an HR standpoint? Well, the HR director said, well, how do we know somebody's not being biased to their hiring? We put in an audit process. You could audit, each one of those directors on a yearly basis or 3-month basis, and you go through that process, and it was auditing after the fact. A couple different things that changed. First of all, it's when you monitor from the beginning, you're assuming that you have a director that's not going to do the right thing. Well, they probably shouldn't be in that position if you don't believe in them. So it was changing that from this is it versus we're just checking to make sure that you don't have any bias on the backside. So we assume that you're going to do the right thing, but we do have to do our checks and balances because we want to make sure as an organization that happens. So it did change that. But more importantly, what it really changed the time to hire and the cost per hire because we were spending so much on HR functions alone. And we really changed that process into where it became into saying it's essentially, again, lowering the amount of keystrokes that people had to do. And those applications didn't have to be touched. They didn't have to be, processed, all that goes through. It was really trying to change it. The biggest thing that we were able to do is, again, you're getting the customer, you're getting the employee that's trying to apply to fill that stuff out themselves, and then making sure that information transfers to everybody quickly. So what you want to be able to do is, again, eliminate keystrokes. So that person fills out that application, right? That application goes through the whole recruitment interview process, all that without any typing, without any process. They're all looking at that same information. And we made sure that our standard operating procedures for that was well written. It said, the director has to send an email and say, this is exactly the amount of hours these are the hours that I have to interview on these days, and be very, very specific. Because what's the worst thing that happens internally? Hey, what day can you meet? I can meet Monday and Wednesday. Okay, well, let's meet at 2 o'clock. I don't have 2 o'clock. I've got 8 o'clock. Well, why didn't you say that in the first email? Well, now 8 o'clock's gone. And so that's a lot of emails, right? It's a lot of back and forth. And guess what? That costs a lot of money. And every HR representative that I have would laugh about, and some directors say, I don't do that. And I've got the emails. You do that. We all do that. But that was a process that was taking so much time. And these are some of the top paid employees, right? Your leaders in your administration and your department directors. They're using so much time just on back and forth. So we wanted to cut that out for the time to be able to recruit and the time to hire. The other part was, onboarding those folks and working around that and making sure that that onboarding process was as quick as possible, because ultimately that's where we were losing a lot of employees, but also that's where we were just losing a lot of funding in our administrative costs were coming so high. And we flat out showed that. We really wanted to show how that happened. Now, the next part of culture that we want to talk about is a culture of iteration. And this is so important. There's no science to creativity. It's about taking intelligent risk, tolerating mistakes, respecting boundaries, and most important, having the right people in place to make the right choices. And one of the things that we want to talk about at iteration is the ability to have successful failures. None of the processes work when people go off stream. We're in community action. I tell people all the time, I always have this, and Patricia, you may have had this happen with board members. They'll call and they'll say, hey, I've got a client that needs assistance. And I'll say, okay, they tried to call and this didn't happen. Can you help them? Sure, we'll check on that. But furthermore, if you have this happen, make sure they use this system to get services. Well, this is just somebody that called me. And I'd sit them down and I'd say, here's the question. I understand you're doing great things, but we serve 150 clients a day. And if you open up your phone number, you'll get 149 calls a day. And that's a process because you've created a system that allows that service to happen. And it will eventually, it'll start out as a highway and eventually it'll be an interstate, and it'll be a process that you've created. And every time you do that, that takes away from the process that we have. And it's very, very intentional. The process is very intentional to be efficient and effective. And I know it's not always the best, and it doesn't create that warm sense of we're here to help everybody. But what I always inform people is when you change processes away from what we've said, someone is going without, because now I've stopped to do this differently that I'm not used to, that the process is not as efficient and effective that's been identified by the way we do it. And when you stop, that takes away from other people getting in. And that takes away from our ability to be efficient and to be effective and ultimately create additional pay. Again, it doesn't feel good sometimes, but at the same time, it's important. Same thing with the process of being very intent in all these systems. There will be failures along the way. Will things happen? Will people not get hired? Will there be issues? Will there be a process and gaps? Absolutely. And will there be people that cheerlead as soon as that failure happens? Absolutely, that will happen. But once you create that culture to say, but remember our end game, it will work out. And if it doesn't completely work out as good as we did, we'll go back to the drawing board and be creative in that sense. And one of the couple of things that we to make sure that you have the opportunities to do that, to be very, very successful, in that we've already created some of those systems that are in place. Two of the big things that we offer now, which is the 5 behaviors of cohesive teams. And this is so important because the ability to be able to work as a cohesive team really, really starts to lower the process and the time that it takes to do that. I'm not asking anybody to be machines. What we're asking is to say, we understand this is efficient and this is kind of how we do that. And what you start to do is you start to see that time free up so that they can take on other activities, the activities that we typically more enjoy, whether it's either sitting around the water cooler talking, having time to do that is a lot better. So we do practice around that. Lawrence does a phenomenal job of creating that trust and being able to build that. The second part is the person-centered, data-driven organizations. And one of the things that piece does, and that's with Fred Richmond and another agency, I just forgot the name, out of Colorado, it really allows people to hone in and focus on what is their process, right? What is the process from the front to the back? And again, I make that joke, and I think people get tired of me hearing me say it, is it's about keystrokes. It's how many keystrokes are we doing, how much is that process, and where we can analyze that. So all that we're asking in this whole thing is that we look at that culture of innovation, and you really start to hone in on all those skills and those processes that you have within the agency to find those. That is all for the presentation, but I'd definitely love to take some questions if that's okay with Lawrence. I guess we have time. And especially if you have questions around specifically things that we had to do, or things that I've learned in the process. What were some of our results with that? So I'll answer any questions if anybody has any. Thank you guys for being here, though.
Hey, David, I'm just curious about how, through this process, how you engaged your staff and really used this as an opportunity to challenge their creativity and looking at this, new system, new way of doing things, and what their response was. Because sometimes that's the greatest challenge. Our own staff can be, until, we really truly engage them, they understand the foundation of what we're trying to do. And that most importantly, that they know we value their input. I'm just curious how that might have played in your previous experience here.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's great. Two ways it was really important. And then one way I failed really bad. So I'll go with the two good first, and then I'll talk about the failure. It's the what's in it for me principle is really what I honed in on. We did that two ways. We first of all had a very large group conversations with different departments, and very specifically, challenged them to say, don't be afraid to talk about things that feel a burden, or that feel like a undue process that we have to do. Feel like that can necessarily be there in a very organized setting. And we didn't want to confuse, I don't like this part of my job and I just want to, gripe about it, versus this is realistically something that we can change and be able to understand that. So we leaned in with that, but in that process is the incentive to be creative, right? And then that was the change, because the last organization I went in was a quasi-public organization, so a very rigorous structured payroll structure, right? And it was very laid out. And so one of the things was going in and explaining that while we can have a structured payroll system, based on positions and whatnot, overall the percentage can change. Overall, those numbers can increase, which increase across the board for a lot of folks, right? And then the second part is understanding that if there are parts of the system that they create, and what we found is most of the staff at all levels typically all thought they were overworked, could use assistance. And so part of that was showing them the overall budget as to here's what this is, and here's what we have. And if we change this part, we can decide, do we want to add additional staff to do these other duties within this? Or are we more concerned about increasing the current staff we have as payroll and then them dividing those duties? So it's very letting them understand that where those processes are, giving them a little leeway to offer in, letting them know that ultimately the decision relied all the way up to the CEO, and that those approvals would have to go. And if there was a concern about outcomes or results, that we wouldn't, that's their decision. But we want to make sure we get their input. The second part that really began to have an impact and takes a lot longer is those one-on-one conversations between a supervisor and all employees at every level. And it was very crucial for us to reteach supervisors about how to invest in people versus how to invest in positions, and understanding that you can have an honest conversation with somebody about, what is your time frame here? How long do you see yourself? They can be as honest or not as honest as they want, but what do you want to do with your life? What do you want to go? We had many folks that were frontline for 30 years and just enjoyed seeing people every day, and they were happy with that. But this would make them happier in the position, and understanding that. And I think for us, what really worked was having honest conversations where we didn't just say in general, we didn't say, well, teachers want this. Well, we had 100 teachers. That's probably not true about all 100, but really saying, no, let's identify that these 40 teachers want this, these 30 want this, because it's very specific documented conversations that really, and part of that for me in that aspect is I come from a coaching background. So it was like, I know I need a center and I need a point guard, and I need to know what they do and who they are and really fit in that mold versus just saying, well, they're all basketball players. That didn't really work, and so that made them understand they feel invested, and that people had the ability to change their mind and share as much as little they don't. And maybe they didn't know. They just said, well, I'm just coming to work every day. I'm part of that 50%. I don't know what I'm doing here, So those two things are good. The third part about being creative that I did really bad, and this is a little bit of that answer, it's a little different, but is would have been investing more time in our finance office. You know, they sometimes are the folks that typically say, here's the rules, here's how we follow them, let's process it. And it's for them to understand, you know, there are different ways to do that, but I really need you. I need you to be able to try to understand and learn even more about what are the open possibilities, where are the flexibilities that we can have, that we can create. So really kind of trying to put them in charge. And I did a horrible job of that. So I was very much like, I hear what you're saying, but that's not the way the law really is. You can do this. And that really came into some of our job duties. We realized were duplicated, as I said earlier. And what we could do is consolidate multiple programs under individuals. But what that meant for the finance office is I wasn't just paying you under CSBG. I'm paying you under CSBG, LIHEAP, Head Start. Well, wait a second, hold on. How are we going to do, you know, we need to have all this, and we need to, you know, and you know, leaning in and listening and saying, okay, well, I need you to be creative. And if it's not something you've never done and you don't know how to do it, how can I give you the tools to go give me the answer? You know, because I'd much rather you go to a class on that and figure it out and bring it back to me than you want me going to that class. So I think that kind of helped, because then I'm investing in them as well, you know. So
Yeah, I think I really like your point about it comes back to what's in it for me. And if we can, the why, if we can answer that question for many of our staff, and what's in it for our clients, because I often find that if I ask that question, it reframes it in a way that engages our staff on a whole different level. And they start thinking about the problem solving process very, very differently and become much more creative, because they are so committed to the children, the families, the seniors that they serve. So I really like that point about, you know, what's in it for me, and hey, what's in it for our clients too if we do this.
yeah, I'm glad you said that, because you're exactly right. I mean, part of the big jump was, you know, we had a lot of families that were, you know, either just being clients or borderline were clients. And so it's trying to relate to the idea that it's not necessarily the clients that we've served for so long too. It's how many are we not reaching, you know, where those families are at, what we could be doing that's more efficient, effective. And many of them would understand, you know, I mean, granted, things I said, well, you know, you get into certain issues like, well, I don't necessarily want to work 8 to 5. Well, I get that, you know, or I don't want to work 8 to 5 is fine. I don't want to work, you know, to 7 o'clock at night. Or one of our things is we did services on Saturday morning, and everybody hated that. And I said, well, that's not really for you, you know, like, and I get it, you know. I mean, I didn't like working Saturdays either, but here we are, you know. So
one of the things that that we are kind of stepping back and taking a look at is the 4-day work week. And of course, they have that major study that's happening in the UK right now, where they're, you know, really evaluating, you know, people's performance in a 4-day work week. Of course, they're paid for 5 full days of work, but the preliminary response from obviously from staff has been really, really positive. And the initial results are showing that they're just as productive as if they were working 5 days, which is very interesting. So I'm going to be watching that really closely. But, you know, if we can create that kind of flexibility, investing in our staff, but still meeting client needs and community needs, that's something that, you know, we want to take a look at in terms of, you know, increasing. It would actually improve recruitment, increase retention, possibly result in more productivity, better outcomes. So we're going to be watching that as an agency really closely.
yeah, there was certain, what we really enjoyed was that shift schedule. So we would do a Monday through Thursday one week, and then the next week you would do Tuesday through Friday. So we had all 5 days covered. Mm-hmm. And then people got a 4-day weekend in between. Now the next one you'd only have 2, but you go 2, 4, 2, 4. And one of the ways that we pushed that, not my last age, it just never happened. We didn't get there. But 2 ago, one of the ways we were able to push that for temporary during the summer, we would run that, was to show how many times people called in on Friday and Mondays anyway. And it's like, people are, and what we tried to show them was talking about is an unplanned absence is a lot more costly than a planned absence. Because if I have a supervisor that I'm paying more money to either A, fill into that role, or B, run around and try to make a solution in the first 30 minutes of the day, that's costly. And that was constantly happening with us. It's versus a planned absence, which, as you know, can be a lot cheaper. You can fill that hole a lot easier. So that was two big arguments that we made. And you start looking at it saying, people want to work a 4-day anyway. Like that's what they want to be. So that's awesome. That's great to hear.
Well, we'll be evaluating it from a distance to see what happens in the UK with that study long term. But it's something certainly, here in Santa Barbara, everyone thinks of it as the American Riviera, but the cost of living here is extremely high.
Yeah.
Of course, what we're able to pay our staff does not come close to what a living wage might provide. And we're going to have to be really outside of the box thinkers to address this issue moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's great. Well, thank you for that comment. Any other questions, thoughts? Well, again, I thank everybody for being here. Always great to see everyone. If we can be any of help with any of those issues that we discussed or opportunities, please reach out to us. If not, you guys have a great rest of the week.